So it's a great privilege to welcome back now for the last lecture in this Faraday course on a very warm Saturday afternoon. Professor Warren Brown, who is Professor of Psychology at the Graduate School of Psychology at Fuller Theological Seminary. He's Director of the Lee Travis Research Institute, and he's also a member of the UCLA Brain Research Institute, and he's done a lot of neurological work himself on the corpus callosum, and particularly on those patients who are lacking genetically or in other ways, say, corpus callosum. He's also written very widely in the whole area of science religion and relating the neurosciences to religious faith. So we're very glad that he's back with us now to speak on neuroscience, morality, and virtue. Thank you, Warren.
Thank you. Following Alistair is not a great placement for me, because Alistair gives such a wonderful talk. You know, it's like, how do you follow such a good job. Also, it's late in the afternoon, and I appreciate that, so we'll try to keep this moving. You can think about the fact, as I do this, that there's really only one response we need at the end. Would you fund this research or not? What I am going to do is not like my previous talk, which was more like a chapter or a book and trying to lay out some information and make some points. This is actually constructed more like a research proposal, because that in fact what it is, where it comes from and where it's eventually going. So we have some sort of preliminary money, and we're going elsewhere with this. Like a good research proposal, I'll start out with a basic philosophical background and questions, issues about moral action in philosophy, and then the point of virtue with respect to that. And then we'll do the review of the literature. So we'll talk about the neuroscience and morality, brain disorders, work on imaging and moral decisions, and then work on imaging and moral emotions. And then we'll get into the heart of the research proposal, and we'll talk about our research design, our study of virtue, particularly the virtues of compassion and generosity. I'll talk about our exemplar design and some of the other things that we are planning in this research. So to some degree, this is a promissory note more than a final answer, but I can give you some interesting pilot data and some thoughts about where you might go in a neuroscience of virtue. And then we'll do some summary at the end. So the philosophical questions and issues, the classical theories of moral action. I'm not a moral philosopher, so this is what my colleagues tell me. That they have the consequentialist or utilitarian view, identified classically with Jeremy Bentham. This is the idea that what is moral is what is best for the most people. And so that when you are deciding about your actions, you do some kind of a utilitarian calculation about what's best for most people. Another idea is deontological, or the idea of duty, identified with Immanuel Kant. And here, when you're making a moral decision, you are arbitrating what is my duty, what is the right thing to do. So for example, I might think it's the right thing to always tell the truth, so I wouldn't worry about what the consequences of this are. It's my duty to tell the truth. Another position is a sentimentalist or emotion, identified with David Hume. And here, when I go to make decisions about moral actions, I arbitrate those decisions on how they feel to me. So I use my emotions to arbitrate moral decisions. And these are represented in current problems that are being dealt with in moral psychology and moral neuroscience. So some of the issues we're interested in is what is the role of moral reasoning, what is the role of moral emotions, or moral intuitions, which kind of interact to some degree with moral emotions, or to what degree do they? And to what degree is moral processing heritable, inherent part of brain function, or to what degree is this learned? So some of the competing theories. First, the competing process theory, identified with the work of Josh Green, and current, or at least he's one of the persons who talks about this, in which reason and emotion compete in moral decision making. And that is particularly that reason has to somehow override emotions for one to make adequate moral decisions. A somatic marker hypothesis identified with the work of Antonio Damasio, and here that moral decisions and other kinds of social decisions are based on a sort of autonomic or emotional response feedback. So I get a feedback from my bodily systems through my frontal lobes, particularly that allow me to sense some things and anchor my social and emotional and moral decision making. We'll talk more about the somatic marker hypothesis later. Another is moral intuitionist. This is identified with Jonathan Haidt. Here emotions serve as a signal regarding intuitions in our moral decision making. So it's still emotions, but emotions are actually signals to broader conceptual networks that give us information about intuitions that we may have about situations and help us make our moral decisions. Another interesting one is the work of Hauser, and he thinks that we actually have an innate moral module, and this is described as sort of analogous to Chomsky's idea of a basic basic linguistic grammar in the brain. We come equipped innately with a fundamental grammar for language. Hauser thinks we have a fundamental grammar for moral processing that is in fact innate. And so he has actually has a classification of the moral impulses that he thinks are part of this innate moral grammar. So those are some of the positions that people talk about or that are coming out of moral psychology and moral neuroscience. A lot of this has the problem of, or the problem we've identified or been thinking about, the problem of decisionism. And the problem of decisionism is that we understand the moral life as being at a moment in time and making a decision. So we make one decision after another, and if we're a moral or not so moral person, it has to do with the making of sort of conscious decisions one after another in our life. And that has some problems. One of it lacks a narrative understanding of persons and moral context. If persons come with a narrative history, they also come with a mental sort of narrative that they are living out, and that may guide your moral actions or moral behavior more than decisions at the moment. It ignores social schemas and social relationships, that there's broader kinds of context than just decisions about this moment in time within which these decisions and actions take place. Most important, I think there's no place for habituated or automatic actions. And we talked about this yesterday, but a lot of cognitive psychologists will say that something like 95 or more % of our daily behavior in any particular day is not consciously arbitrated, it's automatic. And if our behavior is to be moral in any significant way, I would think it needs to be moral in ways that are automatic as well as related to moral decisions. But as we'll see, a lot of the experiments in moral neuroscience and moral psychology have been based on decisionism. That is, we put the person in the scanner and have them make a decision. And there's no significant concern for individual differences. And in fact, our whole paradigm we're going to talk about is based on finding individual differences. The presumption is that everybody makes moral decisions the same way, and then for moral decision making is moral decision making is moral decision making, no matter who you're talking about. And a virtue theory would make another point, I think. So the alternative is virtue theory, which is a fundamental theory behind the research we're proposing to do, or have been involved in doing for the last year and a half, and are proposing to continue. Virtue means settled character traits that dispose people to act consistently in excellent and moral ways. They are settled character traits, which are not necessarily decisions made consciously at the moment. They are important in the philosophy of Aristotle. A lot of the original thought patterns around virtue theory come from Aristotle, although the virtues Aristotle talks about are quite different from the virtues people talk about now. They're very involved in what is he thought to be a flourishing life in Athens at that period of time. Modern versions of virtue theory are represented in the work of Alistair McIntyre and Linda Zazebski. There are others, but those are two representative persons who are currently talking about moral psychology with respect to virtue theory. And an important part of virtue theory is exemplary individuals and their narratives are critical in defining virtue. That virtue really comes out of understanding the nature of exemplary kinds of persons. So that becomes involved in our research. So some exemplary sorts of persons that we have worked with or thought about a little bit as Holocaust rescuers and large community caregivers. And I'll tell you a little more about large communities in a moment. So the idea of an exemplar is built into the story of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan is a moral exemplar. At least that's one way to think about that story. I like this sculptor. This is a sculptor that's on the campus at Loma Linda University Medical School, and it's a sculpture, obviously, of the Good Samaritan. In the far background, you have the priest who has gone by, walked on the other side, and moved on. Then you have the Levite, who, by the way, is dressed in academic regalia and looks very much like a previous president of Loma Linda University. And then the thing that I think is most significant in terms of in-group and out-group is depiction of the Samaritan as an African or African-American in the United States, which suggests an important part of the in-group, out-group relationship that was meant to be told in that story. But anyway, this is a story about an exemplar, and the point of virtue theory is that we understand virtue through exemplars. So let me now deviate from that topic, and we'll come back to it in a minute, but talk about what's going on, at least sampling of things that are going on in moral neuroscience right now, and this is not at all a complete sampling at all. But first, moral psychology or moral neuroscience with respect to brain disorders. And here, we talked yesterday about the famous case of Phineas Gage, so we'll start there. This is probably the most famous case in all of neurology. Phineas Gage, again, was the guy who was working on the railroad, tamping with a metal bar, an explosive charge. The charge went off, blew the bar up through, I'll show you in a minute, up through the eye socket and out the top. Phineas Gage never lost consciousness. Within a few days was apparently okay, but what people said was Phineas Gage was no longer Phineas Gage. Here is Hannah Damasio's, she took the skull of Phineas Gage, which is still around, took the place where the probe went, the camping rod went in and out, and it shows you the fact that it went right through the medial frontal cortex. And so what happened with Phineas Gage has suggested to people clinically about what might in fact be important about the medial parts of the frontal lobe. This is the point that Alistair was making, how rich clinical observation has been in helping us understand important things about the brain. So before the accident, Phineas Gage was an intelligent person. He was a capable and efficient worker, a reliable manager. He was actually in charge of the crew that was doing the dynamiting, although he wasn't too reliable about getting his safety precautions. He was a responsible family man, an upstanding citizen, whatever you want to say about him. After the accident, he maintained his general intelligence, and that's generally true of people with this kind of brain damage. You don't see a change, for example, in their IQ scores. And in fact, you don't see a change in their ability to do language tasks or mathematical tasks or whatever. They're basically maintain their intelligence. But Gage became unreliable and capricious. You could not count on the context he was in regulating what he would do. He became socially inappropriate, would do strange things in at inappropriate times in social situations. And he is described as basically amoral. And again, that wasn't necessarily consistently immoral, but he lost his moral anchor such that there was not a moral guidance to his behavior. In that sense, again, it was capricious. So the American Phrenology Journal said of Gage, and at that time, after the recovery, he was gross, profane, coarse, and vulgar to such a degree that his society was intolerable to decent people. Or his neurologist said he had lost the equilibrium between his intellectual and his animal propensity. Gage was no longer Gage. So he didn't lose consciousness, he maintained a certain amount of intelligence, he just lost his important behavioral regulation. A nice limerick. A moral man, Phineas Gage, tempting powder down holes for his wage, blew the last of his probes through his 2 frontal lobes. Now he drinks, swears, and flies in a rage. Gives you some feeling for the change in personality and the change in moral anchoring that comes from damage to the middle portion of the frontal lobes. So that's a clinical observation. That observation is supported by some work done on people with brain damage to the same area well, actually the direction of the research was finding patients who do not experience regret. And if you take all the patients that do not experience regret and you overlap their areas of brain damage, again you get the same area, medial frontal cortex, that is consistently damaged in individuals who do not experience regret. And so some of Gage's capriciousness could be related to the same phenomenon. You'd expect Gage to fit well into that patient group. Just a comment, all the figures I'm showing you are plain MRIs with circles over the areas in order not to violate people's copyrights, because I didn't have time to get all the copyright permission to show you that expertise. So if you want to see the actual slides at the end, I can show you that. But these are my own reconstructions. So then there's, from the cases like Gage and others that Damasio studied, clinical cases, Damasio came up with the somatic marker hypothesis, an attempt to explain what is wrong with a person who has this form of brain damage. So the somatic hypothesis, or somatic marker hypothesis, was that the experiences with the contingencies of life result in learning of anticipatory, evaluative, either negative or positive, autonomic or emotional responses which are coupled to knowledge. So through life we learn certain evaluative responses that get coupled to our knowledge of the world, positive or negative. And these autonomic responses feed back to the brain to guide behavioral choices in ways that are often not directly available to consciousness. So we get feedback about, we have knowledge of the world. The knowledge of the world triggers in us some emotional responsiveness. We get feedback from that through our frontal lobe system, and it allows us to arbitrate some of the things we're thinking about. My example is I can sit at home in a chair and think about certain kind of things that would be embarrassing, and I blush when I think about doing that. That would really be embarrassing. And so you get just the mere thought of something gives you an autonomic bodily response that feeds back through the medial portions of the frontal lobe. And there's some experimental studies that Damasio's lab did to demonstrate all this that we won't take the time to look at. So individuals with orbital frontal brain damage, like Gage and others, have their knowledge, general knowledge of the world, decoupled from this autonomic feedback system. So they become capricious because they're not anchored in feedback from their own bodily emotional responses. And these are anticipatory in the sense that the contemplation of doing X or Y will give you this autonomic response prior to any decision that you actually make. So the somatic marker hypothesis says we get moral guidance or moral understanding of the world through this bodily emotional So summary of the effects of frontal lobe brain damage on morality. There's a whole lot of other work going on that has gone on looking at frontal lobe brain damage and the relationship to moral functioning. The people with frontal lobe brain damage have reduced ability to abide by moral constraints or social convention. Rational skills are intact, but do not produce normative behavior. So the patients that Damasio brought into the lab, you could give them paper and pencil tests of moral reasoning and other kinds of social reasoning, and they do fine. But you put them out in the world and ask them to actually make decisions in the world, somehow they're not able to do that in that context. So rationally they can give you the right response, but they don't seem to be able to do the right thing. They have little reliance on moral emotions or intuitions. They will not report moral emotions or intuitions. In fact, their solutions to moral dilemmas are largely consequentialist and utilitarian. So if you put them in situations where you give them difficult moral emotions, the response you get is always a simple calculation of what is the best for the most people. They don't have ability to sympathetically otherwise arbitrate the nature of the situation. And children with early frontal brain damage results, particularly orbital frontal, the bottom part of the frontal lobe, results in psychopathology as adults. So that you get a psychopathic personality, a person who is not able to appreciate social relationships and their implications from early brain damage in children. So, moral decision-making, experiments of imaging and moral decision-making. There's a lot of this now, started at least notably with the work of Josh Green that we'll look on. So, Green first looked at easy versus difficult moral decisions. And if you just take easy versus difficult, and again, this is the decisionism paradigm. You put a person in a scanner and have them contemplate a moral situation and make a decision. So harder moral decisions, more difficult decisions, increasingly activate the anterior cingulate, the posterior cingulate gyrus, and bilateral dorsal frontal lobes, lateral frontal lobes. So you have a pattern of activity. There's stories you can tell about what you think the anterior and posterior cingulate are doing, and the dorsolateral frontal cortex, which are the reverse inference that Alistair was talking about. And those stories have whatever credence you want to give them, given reliance on past data. But then their most famous experiment is one that involves a trolley car dilemma. So the trolley car dilemma is you have a trolley car coming down here and you're standing here and you have the ability to throw a switch. If you don't throw the switch, the trolley car goes down and 5 people are killed. If you throw the switch, 1 person is killed and 5 are saved. So the choice is to change a switch that diverts the trolley. 5 people are saved, but 1 person is killed. Most people say this is the morally right thing to do. But if you change the situation a little bit and use what's called the footbridge dilemma, and this is you are on the top of a footbridge and you have the opportunity to push a person in front of the oncoming trolley car to stop it, the same outcome. 5 people are saved, 1 person is killed, but most people say that they could not do this, that this is not the morally right thing to do. And the difference is the need to personally cause, by interpersonal contact, the death of a person in order to save 5 other persons. That's very much more difficult to do. And when you give contrast in the scanner, those 2 moral decisions, they find that you get a lot of activity at that medial frontal lobes, the area that was damaged in Phineas Gage, the posterior cingulate gyrus, and bilateral angular gyrus. Bilateral angular gyrus is the area in the parietal lobe of sort of what Newberg and Diaguili were talking about in the right hemisphere when you are actually what their description of that was also that this sort of was a loss of personal identity in meditation. Well, those areas get active, the personal identity or personal involvement of it begins to activate right, left, right alarms. At least that's the kind of story that gets told about this. Again, the studies need to go on to make sure that you manipulate the kind of variables you expect to be charging up, for example, the medial frontal lobe, and make sure that it gets more intense or less intense as you manipulate that variable. But this is a important study in moral neuroscience. It is highly described. It has a network of structures that get involved that give you some possible interpretive matrix for what kind of things go on in moral decision making when it involves interpersonal interactions. I told you about the work by Colin Cameron and Antonio Rangel and Hare at Caltech. This was that dieter experiment to make that. It's not an experiment about morality, but it is an experiment about control, about making decisions about behavior. And so they had, remember, the dieters make decisions about, or to rate foods by taste and to rate the foods by healthiness, and then gave them in the scanner the choice to make between healthy foods that are tasty and healthy foods that are not very tasty and not so healthy foods that are tasty and so forth, and looked at and divided the people in terms of ability to make the healthy choice, to make the health choice that's consistent with your diet. And so what they found that is activity in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex was correlated with the goal value, that is the preference. So what they decided, which food they decided to choose was correlated with activity in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And and that is your general preference value. But the activity in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex reflected health ratings only in the subgroup that was compliant dieters who actually could control their eating and make the right kinds of decisions. The persons who could not make the right kind of decisions, their ventral medial prefrontal cortex only was activated by the taste value of the food. And the other thing was that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex was active during successful versus failed self-control. So the more active the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex became, the more successful they were at controlling their decisions with respect to the health aspects of the food they were being shown. And again, this was food that they were going to eat, so they were making real choices. At least you give them assurance that 30% of the food you choose you're going to eat as soon as you get done here, so they have some real value. And the other thing is you could show by functional analyzing magnetic resonance images that there was some correlation between the activity of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So these had an apparent functional connectivity, although it was actually through a secondary site, so it wasn't direct, it was through another site. So anyway, this suggests that when we're making decisions about actions that may need to override certain sorts of preferences, maybe the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is important. Again, it's a model based on making moral decisions. Moral emotions, there's a whole lot of studies been going on with respect to a lot of emotions that are social emotions that get involved in moral decision making. So one is empathy, the work of Tanya Singer. Tanya Singer did things like have people in a scanner in which their hand was there and the hand was shown of their spouse or mate that they brought with them. And on each trial, an arrow would point to either their hand or the other person's hand, and a moment later that hand would get shocked. And what they looked at was what is the overlap between areas that are activated by the anticipation that I'm going to get shocked with the areas that activate with the anticipation my friend is going to get shocked. And they presumed that that was a marker of empathy, that is the experiencing in a secondary manner of what I expect my friend to experience. And then again, we have the cingulate gyrus, and we have bilateral insula. So the insula is this little cortex right in there. Again, I'm just circling areas that were highlighted on the fMRI scans. They would come out in little colored patches as Alistair was showing. The experience of fairness. We had people doing a game where one person is given money, that person has the opportunity to split the money and give some of the money to the other person. The other person can say accept it or not accept it. If they don't accept it as not fair, neither of them get any money. But if they accept it, then they both get money. Well, the just utilitarian thing is to always accept it, because if you don't accept it, you don't get even the little proportion that the person offered you. But people don't use utilitarian calculation to do this. There's some partitions that they just think are unfair. If you're going to only give me 10%, forget it. None of us get any money. So that is the experience of unfairness. The difference between fair and unfair interactions, again, lights up the anterior cingulate cortex, the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and the bilateral insula. Social exclusion and inclusion. This is a situation in where a person is in the scanner experiencing virtual reality in which they're playing a ball tossing game. And there's 3 people and we're tossing the ball around, and the person is getting the experience of participating in this in virtual reality. At some point in the game, all of a sudden, they start passing the ball back and forth to you, and you don't get the ball passed to you anymore. So you get socially excluded from the game. And the experience of social inclusion, again, activates a little more posteriorly, but the posterior parts of the anterior cingulate cortex and the right ventral prefrontal cortex, a different part of the cortex. Again, a pattern of activity associated with a social emotion. And then this is a fairly recent study that I thought was fun. It's envy and schadenfreude. Schade is oh too bad, and schadenfreude is I'm kind of happy about the fact that this is too bad for you. That is when you have a person with whom you're jealous and something bad happens to that person that you have certain envy or jealousy for, you get an experience of joy. And so they actually modeled this in the scanner. And so envy was associated with activity, again, in the posterior part of the anterior cingulate cortex. Envy was reading descriptions of persons of various levels of ability, quality, status, people that could be envied or not envied. And then schadenfreude is reading about the misfortunes of envied versus not envied persons. And when an envied person has something bad happen to them, you have activity in the ventral striatum. Again, a social emotion that modulates things that are related to moral processing. So some of the areas involved, if you're going to do the kind of reverse inference that we were talking about before, that is, given these areas that people find to be active in these studies of moral emotions, what areas are they and what kind of thing do we think they do? Well, one we already talked about, the insula, interoceptive sensations, lust and disgust, also love, empathy, shame. These kind of paradigms cause the insula to be active. Also the anterior cingulate cortex, processing of uncertainty, subjective experience, will. I mean, there's a whole kind of list of things, but somewhat in that domain the anterior cingulate is involved with. The orbital and ventral medial prefrontal cortex, the interface of evaluation, motivation, and executive function. Executive function, making decisions about things, the degree to which evaluations, motivations interact with those. Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, executive control and conscious deliberation to some degree. So anytime that good example of that is the Dieter experiment, when the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex was more active, people were more successful at using an abstract idea like health in arbitrating their behavior. anterior temporal lobe and superior temporal sulcus, decoding social cues such as face, body, language. These areas also seem to be important in various studies of social interaction and moral processing, moral emotions. And then there's a lot of subcortical areas that are probably get involved. One of the issues that has to be remembered that Alistair was pointing out is all of these studies represent statistical differences between condition A and condition B, which means anything that's active in both gets subtracted out. So you only get to see what is statistically more active in condition A than B, but none of the stuff is active in both. So I'm pretty sure a lot of those studies had a lot of things going on subcortically that were common to both the control condition and experimental condition, and we're just not seeing it. But we do know that the amygdala, for example, is very involved in fear, but negative social emotions. Septum, ventral striatum, we saw in that one study, hypothalamus, that these structures have also to do. So we have a set of structures. They come up in studies of moral decision making and moral emotions, and perhaps we have in there something like a network of things that both are involved in social emotional processing and involved in moral decision making. But we have our thoughts about other things. Now I want to take a side light about something that I think is important in all of this, and may have something to do with the unique ability of humans to do certain kind of moral processing, also consistent with the Damasio somatic marker hypothesis, I think. And that's the story about von Economo neurons. Von Economo neurons are a very distinctive kind of neuron. They have a very large cell body. There's only one neuron in the brain that says large cell body. That is the pyramidal cell, and you can tell the difference between a von Economo neuron and a pyramidal cell by its cell body structure. So you can, the point is you can get in and fairly easily see these neurons under a microscope and count them and know where they are and where they're not. The first important point is where they are found, and they are found in the area of the anterior cingulate and in the anterior parts of the insula. So these same structures we've been talking about, the insula and the anterior cingulate, have these von Economo neurons, these big neurons. Their cell bodies are there, but their axons pervade most of the cerebral cortex. So you have information, I think, that's taking all the kinds of emotional sensitivity, bodily sensitivity, interoceptive things like disgust, happening fed into the cortex from the insula, as well as the kind of things the anterior cingulate is doing, and pervading the cortical system with those. So an interesting thing about them is who has them and who doesn't. So if you look at apes, you have less than 20,000 von Economo neurons in these areas, the insula and the anterior cingulate. If you look at below the level of apes, you don't find any. So monkeys, a macaque or rhesus monkey would not have von Economo neurons. If you look at human newborns, you have just over 20,000 on the average von Economo neurons in newborn brain. But if you look at the brain of a 4-year-old, you now have over 160,000 von Economo neurons, and an adult over 180,000. This is the work of John Allman at Caltech. So there is the other place they found von Economo neurons, I understand, is in the very social animals like dolphins, whales, and elephants. So again, there's something about, this kind of looks like a index of certain levels of sociality, and the increase in sociality in human infants. John Allman makes a theoretical case that he hasn't proved yet, that the failure to develop from between birth and 4-year-old of von Economo neurons may account for autism. That the absence of this important set of neurons that undergirds certain kind of information coming through the insula and the anterior cingulate to the rest of the cerebral cortex. So I take this excursion to make this speculation, this is my speculation, that it is reasonable to assume that von Economo neurons provide higher human cognitive or cortical processes with a unique degree of bodily autonomic information, including social emotions, that is not found in other higher primates. Thus, von Economo neurons may allow for our distinctive capacity for social emotions that contribute to moral processing. That's a speculation. That's my speculation. I haven't heard anybody else say that, but I sort of think it's true. So let's talk now about our study. So this has been just kind of a review of some of the things that go on in moral and social neuroscience that I think are important to this question. But we have developed a study that we would like to study these kind of questions in a different sort of way. And so this is the research proposal part with some pilot data. Our study is a study of virtue. We were funded by the Science and Transcendence Advanced Research Series, STARS program at the Center for Theology and Natural Science. This is Templeton money that came through. We won the competition and got $300,000 to do this for a couple of years. There's our title of our proposal, or our research project, Rationality of Ultimate Value, Emotion, Awareness, Causality, and Virtue Ethics and Decision Neuroscience. And what we mean by virtue ethics and so forth will be there in a minute. Our group, by the way, myself and Kevin Reimer is a moral psychologist who is an expert in latent semantic analysis of text and also done a lot of work with large caregivers. Michael Spezio is a neuroscientist at Caltech. Greg Peterson is a philosopher at South Dakota State University, and James Van Slyke is both a philosopher, a theologian, and psychologist, sort of cross-trained in those areas for his career. Operational definition of virtue. Virtue is best represented in exemplars. So we use as our operational definition, we define virtue of compassion as whatever motivates long-term commitment to caregiving in large communities, that is, exemplars of compassion. So large communities are an international federation of homes for disabled persons found by Jean Vanier. And these homes house about 8 to 10 persons with cognitive disabilities, and there are 4 or 5 caregivers that live with them for a long period of time. So they're not paid very well. They have no benefits. They are just there because they are motivated to care for people with cognitive disabilities. This is Jean Vanier. So we have questions about virtue of compassion that we think large caregivers, long-term, particularly large caregivers, can give us some leverage on. And questions like, what sort of persons act this way? How do such persons understand themselves in relationship to others? Is compassion dependent upon moral reasoning? Is the virtue of compassion dependent upon emotions, concurrent feelings of empathy? Is empathy actually important in doing this? And what are the psychological and neural substrates of the virtue of compassion? Well, those are kind of our gross, large questions that we're trying to answer in this project. So now let me outline for you our research project, and then I'll give you some of the pilot data. We've been doing this for about 1.5 years, and I'm hoping to get money to extend it. So first of all, we have these real-world exemplars, which are caregivers in these large communities. And Kevin Reimer, our colleague, has interviewed every caregiver in the United States, has 40 interviews of people who have been caregivers for 3 years or more, and 40 interviews of people who have been there a year or maybe 2. So novice caregivers, long-term caregivers. And he has like about a 4-hour open-ended interview having to do with self-identity in these caregivers. So that's one thing. And we do latent semantic analysis, which I'll tell you about in a minute, that helps us pull out semantic information out of those interviews. Then we run the public goods game that I'll tell you about in a minute. Public goods game, we think, has allowed us to identify in the laboratory people who are at least potentially exemplars of generosity and compassion. So we take our exemplars and we do the same interview with our game exemplars that we did with the large caregivers, and we're asking the question of whether or not there's anything in their self-understanding and their understanding of the world that is similar between the people that come out of the economic games and the large caregivers. And then we're interested in their brain functioning, so we're going to have these game exemplars in the scanner, the exemplars and the non-exemplars, and look at what happens when they're doing things like the public goods game, the rescuer game, which is a game we invented, and also viewing videos of virtuous behavior of others. See if virtue and also interpersonal situations are processed differently. Our kind of off-the-wall hypothesis that nobody likes is that virtuous persons are not, in terms of the way they process things in the world, it's not just more of the same, but it's actually a different basic mode or way of processing. So you ask about a really important thing that could kind of come out of scanning. I think it would be really important to know that people who are identifiable as virtuous exemplars actually process these things differently than others, not just more intensely. Then we have a whole lot of psychological assessment instruments. We're giving instruments of interpersonal reactivity, attachment, empathy, pro-social behavior, spiritual values. And then we also are doing some eye tracking and physiological galvanic skin response, skin conduction response studies. So a lot of this plan. What we have now, we have these interviews. We are analyzing the large caregiver interviews. We have not analyzed yet the game exemplars. I'll tell you about the game exemplars in a minute. We've run 200 people through that game. We have a few of them in the scanner. We've got a big bunch of them already scanned. The data that are sitting there not analyzed yet, so we've got a ways to go. And then not much in analysis yet of this. So our real world exemplars, we have large caregivers, 2 groups, long-term caregivers served for more than 3 years, novice caregivers that have served less than a year, and then we have these transcripts of self-identity interviews in 40 long-term and 40 short-term caregivers. And latent semantic analysis is how we analyze this. This is a process developed at Colorado State University. You have a background of millions and millions of words of text that is processed down into I think it's nearly 400 semantic factors. You can take any text and stick it in that 400 by 400 dimensional space, or 400 dimensional space, and locate it as a vector. And then you can take another text and put it in and locate it. And so you can compare text within a semantic hyperspace derived from 11 million words of text from college readers. Text are vectors in space, and semantic relations are expressed by cosines between the vectors. So the larger the cosine, the more similar the 2 texts. So here's a kind of thing. Now this is hypothetical. I'll show you some data that are like this. But if you take a text that represents a virtue, like the virtue of compassion, and then you take the self-expression of long-term caregivers, large caregivers, or short-term novice caregivers, and you say to what degree does this virtue, compassion, semantic information occur in their spontaneous self-descriptions, you can ask some questions about the degree to which this kind of semantic schema is a part of their self-representation. So one theory would make is that long-term caregivers have a higher cosine or more like or include more semantic information about caring than, let's say, the novice caregivers. So here's the text we use as probes. These are derived from some work Larry Walker did at Vancouver, in which he did a whole lot of analysis of words, and we took top 10 caring words, top 10 brave words, top 10 justice words, and top 10 religious words, and put them into text that are something like what people would say about themselves. It doesn't have to be exact because it's taking semantic relationships. You could just put the words in if you want, if you thought you might need to couch it in something that looked more like something somebody would say. And here's some data. This is not a good experiment because there's nothing very well matched between these adolescents and these large caregivers, but we had data from the adolescents, so we thought we'd try, well, let's just look at them. And you can see that the vector average vector for caring, bravery, justice, and religiousness are higher for the large caregivers than this random group of adolescents. A cosine of 5 is a very strong cosine. So, and the interesting thing to us is religiousness is not a big one for large caregivers, even though it's a community with sort of a religious overlay. So being a large caregiver demands or involves other kinds of virtue, self-identity, more so even than religious. This is real data. This is comparing all 4 novice and all 40 long-term caregivers. This is their actual self now. This is what they expect themselves to be 3 years from now, and this is what they expect of themselves 10 years from now. They're really not very different, the blue and the red bars, in their current or 3 years, but if you look 10 years down the road, the long-term caregivers have a more virtue-rich understanding of themselves in the long term than do the short-term caregivers. We think that people who stay in large for long periods of time are different sort of folks than a lot of the people that come in for a year and leave. So that's the kind of thing we're doing. Other kinds of things you can do is take their identity, their own identity, and what they think they are in relationship to God and in relationship to their friends and the long-term caregivers. That's a very tight matrix semantically. For the novice caregivers, that's a very spread matrix. So we use multidimensional scaling to press this down into 2 dimensions that you can kind of graph and see. So that's the kind of thing we're doing with the real world exemplars. A lot more to do there. But we've also tried to find a way in the laboratory to detect something like exemplars, and we've used economic games. Economic games are currently being used to study economic decision-making, reciprocity, trust, fairness, all sorts of things. Such games are also being used to study moral behavior increasingly now. Our question is, are such games capable of detecting virtue? That is, finding other exemplars of compassion and generosity who are similar to large caregivers? That's sort of our experimental question here. So we did the public goods game. We run 200 people in the public goods game. Public good games models giving to public charities. On each trial, players are given some money. This is real money. They get to keep it in the end. They have an opportunity to contribute some of that money to the public good. If enough money gets contributed to the public good and it goes over a certain threshold, everybody gets money back. But if it doesn't reach the threshold, then everybody loses the money they gave to the public good. So if you really want to sort of scam the system, you hope everybody else gives the public good. You keep your own money, don't give it the public good, but you get money back when everybody else does. Or if you're a person who is really pro-social and really wants to see good things happen to everybody, you're giving money to the public good all the time. If enough money is contributed on trial, everyone receives a reward, so forth. So the results of the public goods game was there exists a small percentage of the population, about 18%, who will continue to contribute to the public good well past any expectation of others contributing or of personally receiving a benefit from their contributions. These we hypothesize, these rare people, are individuals that we call game exemplars. Whether these are really virtuous persons or not is the question. But here's the way the distribution works. So this is a statistic that weights average giving, first trial giving, and last trial giving. And when you take that statistic and you just do a histogram, you find 85% of the people down here giving on a very small percent of trials, if at all. These people never gave to the public good. And then it's just completely bimodal distribution. We were absolutely flabbergasted at this result. You got a group of people up here who are very different than the rest, who will continue to give. And so we say, well, these are at least potential exemplars. We call them our game exemplars. These are potentially persons. And the question is this in the laboratory a way to detect something like the virtue of generosity and compassion? And so you might ask a question like, which we'll begin to do now, are the interviews from the game exemplars and the game non-exemplars anything like these virtue texts or anything like what you get from long-term or short-term loss caregivers. You can put them in a matrix, find out what's the average cosine between these texts and the text from their interviews. Well, we're also looking at scanning, and we've done just a little bit enough to put together a poster for a meeting, and not much else. But we're looking to look at functional magnetic resonance imaging. Our tasks are going to be playing the public goods game, also a rescuer game where we have some text also from Holocaust rescuers, and so we designed a game to play that was like rescuing, where you have an opportunity to give money from somebody who a perpetrator is stealing money from, but if you get detected giving that person money, you lose all your money. So you have some risk in intervening to the person that's getting the money from. And then viewing videotapes of compassionate actions. The group comparison will be our game exemplars and the game sort of non-exemplars, that group down here at the other end. Just one result that we found here, our scanning. This is the reaction of virtuous exemplars when they were being told that they didn't, or reminded of the fact that in that trial they did not give to rescue the person who's sort of getting the negative information. We have no idea what the non-exemplars are. This is just beginning sort of a promissory note. The one thing we were amazed in this game is these people, the 8 or 10 people we did run in this so far, while in the scanner, would give away 70 to 80% of their money to somebody who they didn't know, who they knew was getting their money stolen. And this is actually is a real scenario. So we have somebody out there who has money who, if you don't rescue him, this person's not going to get money. So, our current hypotheses: would you fund this research? Economic games can be used to discriminate between virtuous and non-virtuous persons. Game exemplars will be similar to real-life exemplars in their self-schemas and psychological makeups. Game exemplars will have a unique configuration of brain activation while considering virtuous actions. And the moral neuroscientists at Caltech hate this hypothesis. They're utilitarians. Everybody does calculations. If you're more moral, you do the same calculation. You just do it better. Game exemplars will be significantly different from controls in their psychological makeup, developmental histories, and religious ideas and concept of transcendence. So we are putting in some way to understand the religious nature of exemplars. Stay tuned. Where this ends up, I don't know. Final summary of all of this. Neuroscience studies show a consistent network of brain structures involved in moral decisions and moral actions. These structures are not unique, but are part of a system involved in moral emotions and social emotions. Further work is necessary to understand the nature of enduring character and virtue, and that's what we're really trying to move the field towards. And functional neuroscience of moral action, moral decisions, and virtue does not entail neurobiological determinism. Go back to my last lecture. Okay? That's it.
Thank you very much, Warren. So we're going to have a few minutes of questions and also a break before dinner. Thank you. Yes, please.
I was interested when you talked about L'Arche.
Yes.
I lived in L'Arche for
you did?
3 years. As a non-Christian believer,
Yeah.
but not everyone that lives in L'Arche are religious.
No.
There's quite a lot of
Exactly.
non-believers
Yeah.
or people that maybe are kind of vegan.
But there is kind of a religious overlay. It was founded out of Catholicism. There's a little candle ceremony.
All communities are religious,
Yeah.
but you don't have to be religious
Exactly.
to live in L'Arche. And,
Yeah.
I lived in Brest for 2 years, and there was a disproportionately high number of German assistants who I think came, one, to visit Scotland because the Highlands are so beautiful, and to avoid joining the army because of the requirement of national service of some kind, whether it's in the military or and so doing that abroad counts.
Right.
years. So it'd be interesting to know if there's a difference amongst the Washingtons between those who are religious and those who...
Oh, we don't know that yet. That's certainly one.
Yeah.
The comparison with the adolescents, we were actually presenting that data to somebody who is not interested in religiousness at all. So we actually selected out the least religious content in the interviews, but actually the cosigns with that religiousness paragraph were just about exactly the same in that sort of selected to be non-religious and the entire group. So I still think it's probably true that religiousness is not a major motivator per se of people doing service in March, which is, I think, consistent with what you're saying.
Please, yes.
Did you consider assessment for other cognitive attributes, by way of building up a general psychological profile?
Well, we have,
people involved?
we have a set. Whether you always have to make choices about how many different instruments are you going to give these people, but we do have things about pro-social behavior and I forget the whole list, but there's about 8 or 10 different measures that we think are something about basic personality issues that would relate to, that might relate to
I was
caregiving.
thinking of various personality measures as
Yeah.
well as attributes such as verbal and non-verbal reasoning.
Yeah, no,
In terms of
we don't have time to give a race,
Well,
but
I
that
know
would be
this-
really interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
Please.
How do you know when you're conducting these kinds of experiments whether people are being honest with you? There must be a
Well,
rather
we
strong
have-
incentive
yeah.
to play games in this.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons why a person might come out looking like an exemplar is they're just kind of stupid. I mean, that they really didn't get the experiment. So we interview them afterwards to make sure that we understand what they understood about the experiment and what they were doing. So, in that sense. The large caregiver interviews, I mean, they have no reason to lie. You're just sitting and saying, what do you think you're like? And, So, and there was no implication in that when Kevin was doing this, other than we just are interested in what kind of person. So there was that was not done in the context of this virtue experiment. That data is available to us because Kevin had done this other larger study. So, I mean, that's always a problem. Anytime you interview someone or have them fill out a survey, you never entirely know. You look at the validity, reliability issues, and the instruments you use.
You mentioned use of physiological recording in this
Yeah.
context, and you mentioned GSR. I don't know what that is, if you
I'm
could mention what it is, and also in terms of eye gaze, what does eye gaze demonstrate to you in this sort of context?
The GSR is the galvanic skin response, also called electrodermal response. It's a sweat gland response that indexes emotional responsiveness. So we would be interested in emotional responsiveness to stimuli that would be related to compassion, generosity, or lack of that. Eye gaze has to do with what kind of things you're looking at. You're looking at pictures or movies. We're going to there's a group at Fuller Seminary interested in theology and film. So we're going to get them to find clips that are about 10 to 15 seconds long that are useful in the scanner that will show virtuous or non-virtuous behaviors that don't include actors that anybody knows or not famous films that people have seen before, which is going to be a real search through the archives. But that's the kind of thing we would be interested in. Where are they looking? Is there a difference in what people look at, that is what they pay attention to in these kind of situations? And you can put on an eye gazer thing and run the thing, and you can get a nice little map of where they look. This comes out of work we're doing with agenesis of corpus callosum and autism, in which if you look at what they look at in terms of faces, people both with autism and agenesis of corpus callosum tend to look around the map. So what you get from eye gaze is something about what kind of information do people search for in order to evaluate a situation.
And do non-autistic people look at different parts of the face preferentially?
Yeah, they look at the eyes.
All right, right.
Yeah, if you give a person, particularly if you ask them to judge the emotion of this person, you and I, boy, we look right at the eyes, and we're just looking all over the eyes back and forth. People with autism are looking, and agenus of the corpus callosum are kind of looking down there.
Just a small technical point. This is fMRI.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you've got your head stuck inside this tube.
Yeah.
And you've got your head clamped. How do you watch films inside that?
You have
some
goggles.
on.
You can
Yeah,
have a computer screen on goggles that you can wear in the scanner. So that anything you can put on a computer screen, you can have the person look at while they're in the scanner. So that's been a big opportunity, offered a great opportunity to do a lot of different kinds of scanning with different sorts of stimuli being able to do that. So we've done that successfully already.
Thank you. Questions? Well, like that. Thank you.
In the trolley car scenario you mentioned earlier, has there been any studies on neural activity carried out if the person was given the option of self-sacrifice to save
Can you
the
do that again? I didn't quite hear you. A little louder.
In regard to the trolley car scenario,
Yes.
have there been any studies on neural activity done on people who were given the option of self-sacrifice to save the 5 individuals as opposed to...
The trolley car dilemma is a standard dilemma in moral psychology. And so people have given it in a lot of different ways. So I don't know that information, but I'm sure it's been done. So if you actually look in the moral psychology literature, you can find the trolley car dilemma used in a lot of different contexts, in a lot of different ways, asking exactly those kinds of questions. Again, we don't think it's a great way to study moral action because we don't think moral action comes out of sitting around making decisions about dilemmas. That's just not the way people's behavior operates. So that we're interested in virtue because we think a virtue definition is more like what is habitually true about a person's behavior as opposed to what kind of abstract decisions do they make or how do they make abstract decisions.
Yes.
Fascinating talk. The large community, you divide it into 2 groups, those
Yeah.
Is that because you're filtering out people who are authentically virtuous if they stay for 3 years, or do you believe you can acquire virtue between 1 year and 3 years?
Both. I actually just wrote a paper on acquiring virtue with respect to large communities. The paper was based on, I'm involved in a group with René Girard, and I was thinking, you know what, you cannot account in Girard's mimetic theory of mimetic desire and violence, you cannot account for virtue. And so we posed that as a problem to write a chapter for this book. Well, it turns out if you look back in Desire, Deceit, the novel, he has actually described the kind of conversion of heroes in the novel from rivalry and desire to, and so we use that as a way to think about, well, maybe what's happening in the experience of large communities, that people are actually being reformed in the sense that a certain amount of their mimetic desire gets deconstructed, and they learn just a different way of living with people. And the fact that precisely the scenario you gave about somebody wanting not to go to the army, that there are a lot of motives that people have for joining large. One would be, I got this great idea I'm going to be a Mother Teresa, and they get in there, and in reality, they just can't do that, and so they leave. So we would say that the short-term caregivers, not for sure, but are more likely to contain people who have a mixture of motivations for being enlarged, whereas the long-term caregivers are, it's too hard. You just can't stay there unless you're really motivated and captured by doing this kind of work. So that's our rationale for the long and short term. But it's also a rationale because right now that's the comparison we have available to us, because we don't have the same interview yet on just random people out in the world. So I presume that the short-term caregivers even will be different than just taking 40 people randomly off the street.
Great. We're going to have another chance to discuss virtue and also ask questions to Warren and the rest later on. I think we'll break now. We'll just thank Warren again for a great talk. Thank you very much.